What happens when Hollywood's golden image shatters when the queen of red carpets finds herself trapped in a courtroom war that refuses to end when the whispers of betrayal, the silence of allies, and the looming shadow of Taylor Swift's secret? Messages all collide. This is not just scandal. This is the unraveling of Blake Lively. And the moment Justin Baldoni turns silence into his sharpest weapon, the question is not if the truth will come out. The question is how devastating the fallout. Well, be all right, besties, let me take you deep into this unbelievable turn of events because what we are witnessing in this courtroom battle feels like something out of a blockbuster film. Except, it is real life. It is raw. It is happening right now. And every detail coming out feels more dramatic, more shocking, and more explosive than the last. Because we are talking about the sealed declaration that Blake Lively herself filed. And what is hidden inside that mysterious document has already sent shockwaves across Hollywood legal circles and the fan communities alike. Now, you have to understand that secrecy in legal filings is not uncommon, but the way this is being handled and the allegations swirling around it make it feel like we are sitting on top of a ticking time bomb waiting to detonate, because Blake filed this under the claim that she is entitled to treble damages and punitive damages, saying she was retaliated against after she came forward with accusations connected to Justin Baldoni and Wayfarer Studios. She is leaning on a California Statute 47, one that is supposed to protect individuals who come forward with credible allegations without malice. But here is where the drama thickens, because the judge in this case did not use 47.1 to dismiss Justin Baldoni's lawsuit, and still Blake pushed forward with a declaration from an unknown witness, whose name has been blacked out for confidentiality reasons. Now that alone might sound ordinary, because protecting a witness before trial is routine. But what makes this different is the content that was hinted at, the snippets, the little fragments that we were allowed to see, because it appeared to involve a secret audio recording, a recording of a conversation between this mysterious witness and Steve Sarowitz, one of the defendants. And this is where the suspense skyrockets, because if this recording was made without Steve's consent, depending on where it took place, it could either be lawful or completely unlawful, because New York, for example, is a one-party consent state, meaning only one person in the conversation needs to know they are being recorded. But California is a two-party consent state, meaning everyone in the conversation must agree to it, and suddenly, the entire legality of this recording becomes a major question mark hanging over the case. But let me paint the picture for you, because Wayfarer and their attorneys are not letting this slide at all. They responded firmly, saying, yes, they respect the confidentiality of the witness. They do not want that name released. They do not want the project revealed, but they insist the rest of the context should be made public, because according to them, what Blake is trying to do is manipulate the narrative by cherry-picking selective lines from this recording to create damaging headlines while keeping the full audio sealed and hidden from the world. They argue that if Steve himself was secretly recorded, and he is the defendant in this case, then he has the right to demand that his own words not be twisted or hidden behind redactions. He has the right for the court and for the public to hear the full conversation in its raw context. And this is where the legal precedent becomes fascinating, because courts, especially in the Southern District of New York, have repeatedly said that embarrassment, reputational harm, or fear of bad press is not enough to seal judicial documents when documents are connected to dispositive motions, meaning motions that could decide the case. The presumption is that they must be public, and only extraordinary circumstances like genuine threats to safety or exposure of trade secrets could justify sealing them. So here we are with Blake arguing that the information, if unsealed, could bring adverse publicity to this possible witness. But Wayfarer cleverly flips the narrative, pointing out that the person being recorded is Steve, not the witness. And Steve says he wants the full context revealed. So how can Blake possibly claim to be protecting a witness? By silencing Steve himself, it does not add up. And this is where the suspense of the case gets more twisted, because it is no longer just about who said what in that conversation. It is about whether Blake is actively manipulating the legal process by using secrecy to frame headlines on her own terms. And think about it. Besties, every time we have seen headlines pop up around this lawsuit, they seem to come after Blake files something dramatic in the docket. She files it. She quotes from it, just enough to spark a media frenzy, but then demands the court to keep the actual evidence sealed, so no one can check the context. It is the perfect recipe to control the narrative without accountability, and Wayfarer is calling it out directly. They say she is weaponizing secrecy. She is using selective leaks to generate favorable coverage while hiding what could very well undermine her entire narrative of verbal abuse. Because remember, that is what the redacted declaration suggested. that Justin Baldoni was accused of verbal abuse based on this recording, but without the full audio, without the context of when it happened, why it happened, and what was said. After, how can anyone possibly know if it was actually abuse or just words? Twisted out of context, the law requires narrow tailoring when it comes to sealing meaning. Only the parts that truly expose someone should be hidden, like the name of the witness or identifying project details. But Blake wants the entire thing sealed. And Wayfarer says that is not narrowly tailored, it is overly broad, and it violates the principle of transparency. Now, if this were a simple matter of privacy for the witness, I could understand. But here we have Steve, a named defendant, insisting. His own words are being hidden against his wishes, and the court is being asked to believe that Blake somehow has the right to silence him in order to protect someone else, even though it was his voice, his conversation, and his context. And you can feel the tension building, because if the court sides with Blake once again, suspicion will mount that Judge Lyman is biased, that he is leaning in her favor, because many observers already whisper about this judge being too favorable to Blake and Ryan Reynolds, and whether or not that is true. Public perception matters in cases like this because credibility of the system is on the line. And yet there was one recent moment when the judge actually reversed himself. He admitted he made the wrong call about privilege logs involving Jed Wallace and others, and he allowed those privilege arguments to stand, which shows that maybe he is not always one-sided. Maybe he will look at this evidence request with fresh eyes and realize that transparency is the only way forward. But if he does, then suddenly the full truth of this recording will come to light. And imagine if it contradicts everything Blake has been saying. Imagine if it shows there was no abuse, or that the timing raises questions about how and why this recording was made, because if the witness recorded Steve right after Blake came forward, then it looks suspiciously like it was orchestrated for her case. Not a genuine moment of abuse captured organically, and that changes everything, because it puts into question not only the validity of the evidence, but also the integrity of Blake's legal strategy. And think of the optics if the court finds out she has been cherry-picking, twisting words, framing headlines while hiding context. It becomes a pattern of manipulation, of media spin, of courtroom secrecy, all aimed at controlling the story in her favor. And that is why this secret declaration is not just another filing. It is a powder keg waiting to explode. Because if it is unsealed, it might not only expose the truth about this one recording, but also unravel the credibility of everything Blake has been trying to argue from day one. Besties, let us go even deeper into this labyrinth, because the twists keep coming and the stakes keep rising. And what is so striking about this entire saga is how every single filing on the docket seems to pull back the curtain just a little more, revealing not only the strategies of the parties, but the possible motivations that drive them. And here is where the tension intensifies. Because Wayfarer, in their response, makes it abundantly clear that they are not trying to unmask the secret. Witness, they are not trying to expose the identity of someone who may be afraid or who may be testifying in a sensitive matter. They are not asking to strip away protections that are standard in any legal proceeding. What they are saying instead is that the way Blake is using these protections is not to defend someone vulnerable, but to shield her own narrative from scrutiny. And that is a serious accusation, because if true, it suggests she is misusing the legal system to orchestrate headlines, rather than to pursue justice. And when you step back and consider the timing, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Because every time a confidential declaration or sealed exhibit pops up in this case within hours, you see entertainment outlets spinning out dramatic headlines. Blake files something, the press reports on it, the public reacts, and suddenly she looks like the victim, standing tall against an army of critics. But here is the kicker. Those headlines are always based on her carefully selected quotes, never on the actual documents, because those are locked away behind redactions and sealing motions. And now Wayfarer is pointing out the obvious contradiction. If she was truly concerned about the safety of a witness, she would not have quoted their words publicly at all. She would not have invited media coverage. She would not have dangled the juiciest bits in front of reporters while locking the rest away for the judge only. And that is why they are accusing her of hypocrisy and manipulation. Because she is using the protective cloak of confidentiality not as a shield for the vulnerable, but as a sword to strike at her opponents without accountability. And then we get to the part that makes this even more explosive, because the declaration points directly to alleged verbal abuse by Justin Baldoni. And we all know that once that phrase hits the headlines, it spreads like wildfire. The public assumes the worst reputations are damaged, careers are questioned, and the nuance is lost. But what if the full audio shows something else? What if the words were taken out of context? What if the tone, the timing, the reason for the conversation all contradict the label of abuse? What if it even shows Blake or someone connected to her pushing this witness to record something after the fact to help build her case suddenly? What was framed as a spontaneous act of bravery becomes a premeditated piece of strategy, and that difference is enormous, because courts do not look kindly on manufactured evidence or orchestrated recordings, and juries, if it ever gets that far, can smell manipulation when they hear it. And that is why Wayfarer insists on unsealing, because they know that the mere hint of abuse is already damaging. They cannot allow only one side to control the narrative while the other is muzzled. And this is where the suspense becomes unbearable, because we are waiting to see if the judge will force this evidence into the light, or if he will side with Blake once again and let secrecy win. And you can feel the fear behind Blake's legal team. They know that if this recording comes out and if it undermines her claims, it could unravel her case thread by thread. It could turn the tide in favor of Wayfarer and Justin Baldoni. It could even open her up to accusations of abusing the legal system for publicity. And that would be catastrophic for her carefully maintained image. Because remember, Blake is not just a litigant, she is a celebrity. Her career, her endorsements, her brand all depend on public perception. And if the narrative shifts from brave woman fighting for justice to Hollywood star manipulating the system for headlines, it could change everything. And that is why the battle over this one declaration matters so much. It is not just another motion. It is the battlefield where credibility will be decided. And then think about Steve Sarowitz. The man allegedly recorded without his consent. He has every right to demand transparency, because his reputation is on the line too if only selective snippets are allowed out. He looks guilty without context. If the whole audio is revealed, he may be vindicated, and he is not hiding. He is standing up saying, "Let the truth be heard." And that contrast could not be more striking. Blake is pushing to silence and seal. Steve is pushing to unseal and reveal. And Wayfarer is framing that as the difference between manipulation and honesty, between secrecy and transparency, between control and accountability. And you besties know how this plays in the court of public opinion, because people are already skeptical of Hollywood elites. They are already quick to believe that stars use their power, their money, and their influence to bend the rules to control the narrative to avoid accountability. And if this case becomes the latest example of that suspicion, it will not only damage Blake, it could spark an even bigger conversation about how celebrity power intersects with justice. And already there are whispers. Already there are commentators suggesting that Judge Lyman may be compromised, that his repeated rulings favoring Blake suggest bias, or worse, corruption, though he has denied it, of course, but perception is reality. And if he sides with secrecy again, the whispers will grow louder, the doubt will deepen, and the credibility of the court itself could be questioned. But what if he does not? What if he shocks everyone by siding with transparency, by ordering the audio unsealed, by letting the world hear the full story? Then everything changes, because suddenly we will know whether the verbal abuse claim holds water or whether it collapses under the weight of full context. And if it collapses, it will not be just a minor setback for Blake. It will be a devastating blow, a revelation that the story she has been telling the world may not be the whole truth, and that could ripple far beyond this courtroom into her career, her relationships, her public image. And that is why, besties, every detail of this case matters. Every line of every motion, every redaction, every legal precedent cited, because they are not just dry legal documents. They are the pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, may reveal a very different picture than the one Blake wants us to see. And the suspense is unbearable, because we are on the edge, waiting to find out which version of reality the court will allow us to see, and which one will remain locked away in the shadows. Blake Lively thought she had seen the worst when the court forced her to hand over documents, and when the whispers about the Taylor Swift messages began, but nothing could have prepared her for the way the Hollywood machine began to shift against her, because this was no longer just about a courtroom battle. It was about perception, power, and loyalty. And in Hollywood, those things often weigh heavier than facts and evidence. The first cracks started to show when industry veterans who had once praised Blake for her charm and her ability to fit into every glamorous setting suddenly went silent. It was as if no one wanted to be caught standing too close to her in case the fallout grew even worse. Red carpets where she had been guaranteed. The spotlight now felt tense, Photographers still snapped pictures, but the smiles seemed strained. The journalists still asked questions, but their tone had shifted. They no longer seemed awed by the glitz they were digging for weakness waiting for. The slip, and Blake felt it all, even if she smiled for the cameras, because when the lights dimmed, she knew she was in a fight for survival. Justin Baldoni, on the other hand, seemed to be playing a different game entirely. He stayed quiet. He let the filings and the leaks do the talking, and that silence became his sharpest weapon. Because while Blake pushed back with legal maneuvers and press whispers, he simply waited and let the world connect the dots every time a document dropped. Every time. A judge made a comment every time a lawyer for Blake seemed cornered. His reputation ticked upward, little by little. He was being painted as the one who had been wronged. And the public loves nothing more than a story of vindication. The dynamic grew more dangerous when Taylor Swift's name refused to leave the headlines because her involvement through those alleged messages was like gasoline on the fire. The speculation about what she said, how she said it, and whether those words would support Justin or expose Blake kept fans and journalists on edge. Entire forums lit up with theories, some claiming Taylor was about to destroy Blake. Others insisting that Blake had dirt on Taylor that could flip the narrative, but in truth, no one really knew. And that fog of uncertainty created even more drama, which only deepened the sense that Blake's position was collapsing from every side. Insiders began leaking little details about Blake's own worries. They said she had screamed at her team behind closed doors, that she felt betrayed by people she once trusted, that even Ryan Reynolds had told her to tone things down because their family brand was suffering. It was not just rumor anymore. Major outlets began hinting at marital strain, even suggesting that Ryan was distancing himself from her legal strategy because he feared being dragged down too. The thought of Hollywood's golden couple fracturing under the weight of this case created another wave of public obsession. And that obsession only made Blake's situation darker, because now it was not just about her career, it was about her home life, her stability, and whether she could withstand the storm. As the hearings dragged on, the judge seemed less and less sympathetic to Blake's side. Her motions were denied, her objections dismissed, and each small defeat added up to a bigger picture, one that suggested the court was not buying the story she had been trying to sell. And when legal analysts began going on television saying bluntly that Blake might have overplayed her hand, it marked a turning point. The powerful narrative she once controlled was slipping away. Justin's camp began to leak carefully timed statements stressing that all they wanted was the truth, that they were prepared to show everything, that the evidence would speak louder than anyone's spin. It was the kind of messaging that cut directly against Blake's more frantic image, and it resonated because people always prefer the side that seems calm, collected, and unafraid. The real shock came when whispers emerged that several of Blake's former allies in the industry were now cooperating with Justin's team, not because they liked him, but because they were tired of covering for her. These were people who had once attended her parties, smiled in her selfies, promoted her projects, but who now felt she had gone too far, too reckless, too willing to burn everything down, just to win one case. And once those rumors hit the press, Blake was painted as a desperate figure, cornered and isolated. The truth is, Hollywood has no patience for weakness or desperation. It can elevate you overnight and turn you into a cautionary tale just as quickly, and Blake was learning that in real time. The suspense grew unbearable when one reporter claimed that new subpoenas were targeting not just Blake's communications, but also the communications of influencers and journalists who had covered the feud. This revelation sent shockwaves through the creator community. Suddenly, this was not just celebrity gossip, it was a legal net that could pull in voices from YouTube, from podcasts, from tabloids, and the fear that people could be dragged into depositions made the story even juicier. The public could not look away. Some even celebrated the idea that Blake's attempt to control the narrative had backfired so badly, it now threatened to expose her own allies in the media. Justin remained silent through it all. But his silence was not weakness, it was strategy. The more Blake flailed, the stronger he looked, and every analyst, every commentator, every fan who dissected the filings agreed that if things continued on this trajectory, she was on track for a devastating collapse. And yet Blake did not back down. She doubled down. She insisted to her inner circle that she would fight to the last breath, that she would not let Justin or Taylor or anyone else destroy what she had built. But in doing so, she created the impression of a woman unraveling, a woman losing her grip. And that image, once it took hold, was impossible to shake. This was no longer just a lawsuit. It was a spectacle. A slow-motion implosion playing out before millions who could not look away. The end. The story of Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni had become more than a legal battle. It was a mirror reflecting the fragility of power and the volatility of Hollywood fame. Because here was a woman once adored, once untouchable. Suddenly, forced to defend herself not only in court, but in the court of public opinion. And every move, every word, every silence became evidence in the greater trial of reputation. The looming release of the Taylor Swift messages stood as the ultimate cliffhanger, a symbol of truth or destruction depending on who you believed, and that uncertainty was what kept millions glued to every update, every headline, every whispered leak. Blake's image, once polished, now bore the cracks of desperation, and yet there was still the faint chance that she could turn it around, that some twist in the narrative could shift sympathy back to her side, because in Hollywood, stories never truly end. They evolve, they twist, they transform into something else. Justin remained the calm center of the storm, refusing to take the bait, refusing to flail, and that steadiness made him look like the inevitable victor. But the truth is, no one really knew. Not the journalists, not the fans, not even the lawyers themselves, because when reputation, power, and secrets collide, the outcome is never clean, it is messy, it is brutal, and it is unforgettable. And that is why this case will be remembered not only for the verdict, but for the spectacle, the implosion, the revelation that even the brightest stars can be pulled down into darkness and left scrambling to survive as the world watches without mercy.